it's quite amazing to see so many people here at this event that 4 years ago someone thought would sit in the front half of the Johnson Institute seminar in Archaeology. But it's a real pleasure on behalf of the entire Personal History team to welcome Sir David. Thanks very much.
This is a bit of a surprise to me. I thought I would be invited to talk in a reminiscent way to half a dozen people about the early days of television and archaeology. However, I'm very flattered. I joined BBC Television in 1952, October. I can't say I did it as the end combination of a lifetime ambition, because the plain fact of the matter was that actually I had never seen television. Mind you, I was not in the minority. The bulk of the British public hadn't seen television in 1952. It came, all programs, live, and they came from two small studios up in North London, Collison, which in fact is the place where the first public service, or the first public broadcasting system in the world had its great success, the BBC. So I hadn't applied to join even. I had applied to join BBC Radio, but Radio didn't want me, and somebody in Collison, this infant organisation, happened to see my application and wrote and said, would I be interested in joining? So I fixed up £2,000. And it was there I met Gyles, who is in fact the hero of this afternoon, Paul Johnson. Paul was an astonishing man. He was 3 years older than me. He was born in 1953. And he had got a scholarship, an overall scholarship to Oxford in 1939, but then volunteered to join the Navy as an embassy. And during the 4.5, 5 years of war, he served in motor gunboats, a lieutenant, in command of the motor gunboat, and indeed he took part in the D-Day landings. So he was an experienced seaman. And he was also, I have no doubt, a brave man. You can't be in command of a motor gunboat without having some ideas about how to lead people. And it was a privilege for me to join him. Now, Paul ranked at that time as one of the great experts of doing non-fiction television, because he had actually been doing it for 3 whole weeks. That's not quite true. He'd made his first program the week before I joined him. So he obviously had 100% more experience than I did. He explained to me what the program was I was to assist him on. And it was called Animal, Vegetable, Mineral. And I gather that some ancient recordings of it, of some of this program, have been shown earlier on this afternoon. The aim of the program, the BBC was avowedly and unashamedly interested in spreading information in those days. And to do so, in a way which would attract people who were not sure that they wanted to imbibe any information. And the head of our department, who bizarrely was called the head of talks, another distinguished woman, Mary Adams, had cooked up this program, which I think was a copy of something that had been going on in the United States, in which you assembled 3 experts, primarily archaeologists, it has to be said, but anthropologists too, and presented them with objects. There was a chairman who was supposed to give points, and it was supposed to be a challenge rather from the museum that had presented these objects to these experts. And the chairman would give 3 points that they got it all right, and so on and so on. Points, of course, quite irrelevant. The main object of the exercise was that you gave an object to a scholar, an archaeologist, and they then went through the processes which would enable them to identify what it was. A process of logical thought which actually was not familiar to a great number of the audience. So that, for example, he would look at something and say it was stone, and then perhaps he would identify the stone, where it came from. He would look at the way in which it was made. He would, that give him a clue as to date. He would then hazard a guess as to its function, and so on and so on. And then the chairman would say, very good or not, whatever it was. And prominent, the chairman was an archaeologist from this university, Dr. Glyn Daniel, who became the deputy professor in due course. And Glyn played it marvellously. And he had a group, a varying group of experts who had presented these objects. Prominent among them was Sir Mortimer Wheeler, who archaeologists among you will know very well as one of the great pioneering archaeologists of the 20th century, with excavated in Maiden Castle and many other places too. And Sir Mortimer got hold of this idea very quickly, and Sir Mortimer was something. Your granddaughter's here, but it's all right. I say.
It's all right. Say what you like.
He was extrovert. He also had a moustache, which was very useful for extroverts, because you could do a certain amount of this and that, and twiddles. And he played the game absolutely to perfection. Say, he would present with an object, and he'd say, my goodness, what on earth can that be? And then we'd go through the whole process. And then it would turn out, of course, that he actually had excavated it. So he knew it backwards. And Glyn Daniel, the chairman from St. John's, and Mortimer did this double act with supporting cast. Other people who appeared, forgive me for saying that, but they were by and large supporting cast. And the process was that somebody had to go to a museum and select objects. And that was my job. So Paul said to me, when you go to the museum, we're going to do it from Salisbury or wherever, go and find 15 to 20 objects which will be susceptible to this kind of treatment. So away I went. Now, one discovered that early on that the people who were going to appear on this program, the archaeologists, were much more sensitive about their reputation than I had supposed. When it was announced that we were going to go to Durham Museum, suddenly great experts from the British Museum and so on were seen going up to Durham and seeing where an object had been taken away. They said move temporarily for examination and making notes of what this was. People, I'm older and wiser now, but I realised that it was actually not a good thing if you appeared on television as professor of archaeology from somewhere or other, and you failed to recognise the sort of thing that your first year undergraduate would be expected to know. So I had that job, and that was quite hard work in the sense that actually at that time, and maybe still, museum didn't want really celebrated things to go, and certainly didn't want very valuable things to go. And quite right too. I went. Now, so long ago, and I know it is not going to tell anybody, but it is a long time ago, I went to the Salisbury Museum, and they didn't have a heck of a lot that I could would be suitable for the, I mean, of course, very valuable collections and all that. But we also wanted to show important things. And the Salisbury Museum has a thing called the Wilton Bowl, which I expect some people to be here would already know. And I said, would you lend us the Wilton Bowl? And the curator, a very nice man called Hugh Short, said, I'm sorry, it's out of the question. It's far, far too valuable. And I said, I promise you we'll look after it. I mean, it's very precious, and we'll have commissionaires standing by at all times, and so on. And he said, they said, no, well, I can't anyway, because it doesn't actually belong to the museum. It belongs to Lord something or other. And I can't contact him, and we mustn't lend it without his permission. So we had a great deal of toing and froing on that. In the end, we got Wilton Bowl. Now, the beginning of the programme starts with a packing case spinning with, on its four sides, animal, vegetable, mineral, query, animal, let's see. And then it lifts magically, and a pair of hands, and this was Paul at his best. Paul realised that you had to put a pair of hands in quickly, because otherwise the viewer didn't know the size of what the object was. A good educational point. Anyway, a pair of hands went in and took out an object. And this was always the star object. So that was going to be the Wilton Bowl. And it came out, and in due course it was passed, and Mortimer Wheeler gave a dazzling dissertation about the art of this particular period, and about the nature of the clasps on the side of the bowl, which are beautiful in yellow, and enamel, and so on, lovely Celtic design. And that was very good. And that night, the things were packed up, sent back to Salisbury. The following morning, just a Sunday, the following morning, I had Hugh Short on the phone. One of the clasps was missing. So I said, it can't be. He said, yes, my job is at stake. The country's historic artistic traditions damaged. I simply don't know what to do. I said, don't worry. We will find it. So Sunday morning, I'm on my bicycle into the studios, this time at Line Grove, and going through the sweepings. Nothing. Well, the last lot of sweepings, however, had been put in the incinerator. So I go down and find the incinerator and plug through it to the ash, hoping I might find the molten, semi-molten remains of this artistic treasure. Nothing. And I was really in despair. Then I suddenly remembered, of course, that actually the bowl had been put in the spinning crate. So I went upstairs, went up to the studio, into the property, found the crate. There, at the bottom of the straw of the spinning crate was the missing glass. My job was fortunately safe, as was the artistic traditions of this country. That was the sort of thing we had to do. We also occasionally, I thought that one occasion, Mortimer Wheeler, I thought he was being so clever. I thought we would put in a fake. See what he said. So archaeologists and museum people here will know very well that there's a thing called fakes of Neolithic axes by a gentleman called Flint Jack, who made a number of these fakes during the 19th century, which resided in a number of museums of great or even greater distinction. And I thought we'd give him one of these, and that would be quite fun. It was a silly thing to do, really. I put in a specimen of Flint Jack's work, and Mortimer Wheeler said, Benson, someone next to him said, yes, well, it's very familiar with the cat's pattern is perfect. Beautiful pressure flaking, I mean, we can see it's wonderful and probably used in that, all that stuff. And Wheeler then said, oh, well, he said, yeah, I suppose some people could say that this was a Neolithic hand axe. Actually, of course, it's a 19th century confection, of course, from Jack. So that was that. Well, the very next day, the next program was actually from York Museum. I know there are people here from York. And this is probably another story out of school. Well, never mind. And there wasn't much archaeological stuff, really, that was at that time in York, which was suitable. And not only that, but we had a distinguished biologist on the team this time, Sir Julian Huxley, a great authority at this time. And I had been against including Sir Julian Huxley, not anything against Sir Julian, but it seemed to me that the facts of questions of natural history were not susceptible to the kind of explanatory, explicatory conversation that we would give. Because you either knew it was a bar-tailed country or you didn't know it was a bar-tailed country. You couldn't work out some rationale about that. And York couldn't provide me with anything for Julian Huxley. However, I went into the basement, and then in the corner, I saw what I recognised immediately as a great orc. So I said, could we borrow this? And the curator said, oh, certainly. He said, I was paying this thing. It doesn't fit in with our collections at all. I would be very glad. Of course, it's extraordinarily valuable. I mean, people pay huge sums of money for this great orcs, extinct bird after all. So if you put it on, we should probably have a Dutch auction before we know where you are. We will make a lot of money for the museum. So I said, no, certainly be a pleasure. The great orc, of course, came up. And we put it on a turntable because every donkey was span around. There was one of the Weaver. And there was Julian Huxley. Now it so happened that Julian Huxley had been a bit derisory about the programme. He said it's not really the sort of science that he enjoyed, but nevertheless he would do his best. And up comes this thing, and Julian Huxley said, or Glyn said, so Julian, I think this is your bird. And Julian said, oh yes, well of course. I mean, anyone can see what that is. It's an extinct bird. It's called the Great Walk. And I thought he would then go and give us some stuff about when it was extinct and why it was extinct, the fact it was flightless and so on. Not at all. He just go, extinct, Great Walk, end of story. So, in that said, well, I don't know whether anybody else has got some more, but have you got anything to add? Well, said he got this bird and put it on his knee. And he said, yes, well, as Sir Julian says, it's a great orc. Or shall we put it this way? It's a rather crude simulacrum of a great orc. Now, I can see the curator. Yes, continued Sir Mortimer. You see, it's a penguin's beak. And these are chicken feathers, rather crudely designed, but it's really rather an incompetent fake. And you could see the poor curator of the Museum, visions, thousands of pounds, simply collapsing around him. And I thought he was going to sue us, but fortunately he didn't. And that was the beginning of a somewhat uneasy relationship between Glyn, the programme, and Sir Julian, because although Sir Julian was pretty dismissive about the educational ambitions that Paul and I and everybody else producing had for the programme, he didn't think that it was really science. And we used to have a dinner in order that the members of the panel should get to know one another, and there would be mutual warmth before we got into the studio. And mutual warmth, of could get a bottle of 36 mutual warts. These more size of the rest forms used, and so we indulged in quite a lot of mutual warmth. and he was very keen on mutual warmth. And Julian was there, looking a bit acid, I think, and he said, Glyn said, well, Sir Julian, I hope things are going well. Julian said, I'm really not very happy with this program because I don't think it's sufficiently educational. I mean, it's the problem is, you see, that you can't really say anything precise about these things. And Glyn said, well, actually what we wanted Julian with is an informed chat. And Sir Julian said, chat? That's exactly the point. You're an archaeologist, aren't you? Not a hard scientist. So, mutual warmth wasn't spreading as widely or as warmly as one might have wished. So, by the time we got into the taxi to go into this live program, there was a slight edge between Sir Julian and the chairman. And I'd selected the objects. Up came one of them, and it was an egg. And I had selected this because I remember when I had gone to my practical in the zoology department in this university, not as far away from here somewhere, I had been presented with just that kind of egg. And so I knew that it was the egg of a mollusk, of a giant West African snail called Achatina. So I thought, well, first year's practicals, every undergraduate knows that, we'll give it some more to do. Up comes this egg. Now, says Glyn Daniel, some more, Sir Julian. What about that? And Julian said, well, absolutely evident. There are only two classes of animals in the world which lay eggs, reptiles and birds. Now this is not a bird egg because the shape is wrong. So it's a reptile egg, and from the sides of it, some kind of lizard, but one can't possibly say what. And Lynn said, well, I hoped you might be able to be more precise. And Lynn said, well, that's because if I may say so, you don't understand zoological science. I mean, you cannot be precise about species, about this sort of thing. But it's a lizard egg. Well, said Glyn, do you know what it said on the card? And Julian said, well, I think you'll find, and probably you don't recognise the scientific name. I'm exaggerating a little. I think you'll find, he said, when you speak the name, you'll find that it's a reptile. And Glyn said, don't think so. And Julian, this I do remember, he said, well, that's because you're an archaeologist, not a scientist. And I will bet you £5 that when you speak that Latin name, you will discover it's a lizard. I think I want to do because I was directing cameras, and should I show Julian looking trucking? Should I show Glyn Daniel looking as though he just swallowed the cat? I chose to put it on Glyn. Glyn said, well, on the card it says Achatina, a giant West African snail. I think it's only £5. When we got out from the hospitality at the end of it, all the press from Fleet Street was there. Looking to see photographs of a £5 note being handed over by Sir Julian to Glyn Daniel, but they never got the picture. So Animal Vegetable went on its success to success. In fact, it may come as a surprise to people here that actually Sir Mortimer Wheeler, in, what year was it, 1955, 56. Sir Mortimer Wheeler, just think about this, Sir Mortimer Wheeler became the television personality of the year. There you are. I mean, not a pop singer, not a cook, no, an archaeologist. And he deserved it, because librarians around the country told us, the BBC, and said the shelves on which archaeological books had sat for decades, untouched, and suddenly vanished, but empty. Archaeology became a huge success. Archaeology became a matter of interest to anybody with any intellectual curiosity at all. And it was a sensation. Now, in fairness, I should say that at this stage, the BBC was the only television service in this country. There was no competition. If you watched television, you watched BBC, and you watched BBC One. It wasn't even called BBC One, it was just BBC. There was one network only. And under those circumstances, it wasn't all that difficult for the BBC to persuade people just to sample something, and having done that, to realise that they were interested. That privilege, if that's what it is, certainly that luxury has been withdrawn from the staff. And so it is a difficult problem persuading people who don't know anything about the subject that they might sample it and see what it looks like. Now, after that success, Paul, being Paul, realised that it was not good enough to just going on about quiz shows and animal, vegetable, mineral, that he and Glyn, between them, decided that the moment had come, enough people had come to do something more serious, to do something more in-depth, something more concentrated. And he together with Glyn and Mortimer Wheeler, decided that they would start a series of programs, one of which I think you've seen about the British Bowl, which you would call Buried Treasure. And this would be a serious examination of some particular aspect of archaeological knowledge. And he then thought that this is not simply going to be a slide lecture, animated here and there. We ought to do something a bit better than that. And he then made an advance which I think he ought to be credited with, something that was new. He actually invented experimental archaeology. Now, I will stand to be corrected if there are archaeologists here who think that experimental archaeology was conducted before the 50s. But I don't think it could possibly have been conducted in front of such a big audience. And one of the first things he did was to examine the question of Stonehenge. As everybody here would know, Stonehenge has, in between the huge sarcens, the huge trilithon, monoliths and so on, it has small blue stones. And it's common knowledge that they come from the Preseli Hills. How did they come? Well, there were a number of theories. You could have taken it round the coast, you could put it on ships, you could have done all sorts of things. And Paul decided that he would actually find out what was possible. And he recruited a team of boys from the schoolboys and constructed sledges and put cast stones that were the same weight and size as the blue stones, and saw how many people it took to drag it, how far in a day. We measured the possibilities of this transport of blue stones as being, how did they bring it across by sea? Did they bring it around the coast and so on? And that was only the first of the great number of experimental archaeology which Buried Treasure pioneered. I strayed from the golden path of anthropology after animal vegetable and pursued my own line because I was a biologist and not an archaeologist. And eventually I came into BBC administration, and I was responsible for programs on BBC Two, which was the BBC's new network. And it was then that I thought that we could really build on this huge success that we had and have a department, not only of archaeology but history, in which we would have regular programs that would be headed, of course, by Paul Johnson. And so we set up this unit, and we set up a new series called Chronicle, which handled a 50-minute programs looking seriously at archaeological digs and archaeological news from around the world. And it was my hope, and indeed it was Paul's ambition, that the BBC then should have a unit which was known in archaeological circles around the world. So that if an important find had been made, like, for example, 3.5 tons of gold or however it was that had just been found recently, that the first people that would ring up before almost anybody would be the BBC unit. And it would happen not only whether it was in Wessex, but whether it was in Guatemala, that round the world the BBC would have a reputation of having the archaeological unit as being the first place where you would send, where you could get skilled cameramen and knowledgeable producers who would come and help you chronicle and document the process of your dig. And that proceeded rather quite well in the first years. And to increase to a second innovation which we wanted to make was that we should actually conduct an archaeological dig. At least we should supervise or watch an archaeological dig that was timed to a timetable and to criteria which were not television's criteria or timetable, but academic timetables. So that you wouldn't question that you've got to wait until the cameras are there, because we were going to have cameras there all the time. And if necessary, we would keep them there over weeks, and if necessary, we would return in the following season, and so on. So we would conduct archaeology in front of the eyes of the public, with a distinguished archaeologist in control, and people would really understand the process of archaeological discovery. And the first place we decided to do like that was Silverhead. And it suited me very well as responsible for BBC Two, because it was next door to that arterial road, the A4. We would have outside broadcast vans, there's BBC Two on it, and we would attract a big public, and it would help the publishers of BBC Two. And so that was done. I may say that when I announced it, the first thing I said went to an assembled press was, now we're doing this, but let me make it absolutely clear from the word go, this is not a treasure hunt. We are instead, the treasure we are looking for is information. And then the chap from the press at the time says, well, I mean, you were saying that if you've actually found a golden treasure full of a grave full of gold ornaments and so on, you'll be sorry. I didn't say that. So in the end, so you don't say BBC is on a treasure hunt. And when in fact we didn't find anything in nature of the burial at the end of the first season, it had the press immediately said, oh, it was a disaster, it was a failure, they picked the wrong thing, they didn't find the treasure they wanted. But that apart, or indeed perhaps not apart, that essentially was one of the valuable things which the excavation of Silverhill did at the time, was it showed that this was not a treasure hunt that knowledge was what was being sought after. And, but the fact was we didn't find treasure. But it was, in my view, a very important advance that was again led by Paul. Now, you will have heard from what I said that I left archaeology in British television when I left animal, vegetable, mineral. But happily, we've got three people here who then worked not only on buried treasure, but on Chronicle, which was a series that followed. And I'm going to ask them to join me now on these chairs, so that when you ask me questions about 90% of the BBC's archaeological output, I don't have to ask them, but they will. So first of all, Ray Sutcliffe. Where's Ray? Benson, Gyles, who conducted many of the, directed many of the filming. David Collison, who was in charge of Sutcliffe. And he's wearing the Silver Hill tie, last one at Captain. Now then, are there any questions, particularly about those programs, Chronicle and Buried Treasure, which actually did more than just, they weren't just quizzes. I mean, they were major archaeological didactic programs, and if you have questions about them, I'm sure that the four of us between us will be able to answer. So, anybody? Yes?
Letters from the time and the speaker indicated that television is seen as a great power and a medium to bring archaeology to the public. But I'm just wondering why BBC had this mandate when your much documented difficulties with technology were there, because the focus, the cameras were cumbersome, and I imagine taking them to Silver Hill was quite difficult. Was it just because Talk's programming was determined by the personalities and interests of those employees? So you went on to do natural history programs, and Paul Johnson was a historian. So was it a personality that we see rather than a popularity?
I'm going to sit there.
Silbury was a technical challenge, to say the very least. In 1968, we couldn't get BBC Two in Wiltshire at all. So our engineers rigged an enormous mast about 300 feet high and bolted it into the ground just on the side of the A4. And with some stuff called camera tape, it was very sticky. They got a small black and white monitor and strapped that into the corner of the control van. And they said, right, there you are. When that screen goes blank, you're on the air. And we had no means of keeping in touch with the television centre whatsoever, because although it was an expensive operation, funds were limited. So technical things that might have made life very much easier in this day and age were simply not available to us. The cameras were cumbersome, but in fact, it's interesting to note that Silbury was the one place where we actually pioneered a small handheld camera. It had miles and miles of cable behind it, and it took 3 riggers to hold it to get it into the end of the thing. But we put first-class colour pictures onto the BBC Two screen live in 1969. So it was a challenge, and I think the other part of your question was the decision to go to Silbury occasioned by Paul Johnston's wish to further his own interests in history and archaeology? Well, yes, I think it was, but with tremendous support from the controller of BBC Two on my right and by Desmond Hawkins, who was the head of BBC and BBC West. The three of them were determined that it would be done. And I think between you and me, they've been dreaming of doing it for years before. Thank you.
Any more? Yes, sir.
you think that popular culture and media have a role in archaeology today?
Ray, obviously you're looking baffled, so you go, Jack.
Absolutely, because I think people don't necessarily immediately see what they have before them, and the presence of an archaeologist who can interpret that material brings it to life in a way that only comes when they keep in years, and that's a much later stage. I also slightly, this is a digression I was going to make after David's comment, but it's worth remembering that quite a lot of its early life, Chronicle was in black and white. Colour was an invention, and of course it's so many things on their heads, because of course black and white is unnatural, and colour is natural. BBC actually put BBC colour at the back, in case you hadn't noticed. The British archaeology can be spectacularly uninspiring at times. In black and white, it's genuinely so.
More. Sir.
So David, you furnished us with some wonderful details of the general public's reaction to animal vegetable meal. I was wondering if you could tell us more about initial response to the televised archaeology in academia, particularly at the University of Cambridge.
How did the universities, and especially Cambridge, react to having archaeology put onto television?
Well, there are a number of apocryphal stories about about how it was received amongst the academic community. There's the one in the very early days when a BBC producer rang up a distinguished archaeologist in Oxford and said, would he be interested in appearing on Animal, Veg and Mineral? And he said yes, but how much do we have to pay? But there's Lord Renfrew here, so, who made programs in the Chronicle series which reflected his latest and, if I may say so, quite complicated archaeological theory, and who took us through Minoan Crete, for example, or the megaliths of Malta, and told quite high-level archaeological propositions in language which ordinary viewers could understand. It had huge audiences, you know, it got audiences of 4 million, 5 million. David, you can remember what it was? How much?
Certainly, we managed, in the early 70s, we were regularly getting audiences between 2 and 4 million.
It's not a news night.
So, you know, we did, and the unit did propagate archaeological knowledge of quite sophisticated kind. And I'm sorry that there is a unit now that's still doing it.
Can I just pick up on that?
Yeah.
It's about Glendanny, because in fact, one of the things that Paul did when he first was offered the editorship of the History of Archaeology unit in the starting Chronicle was he made sure that his principal advisor was Professor Glendanny. Now, Glenn, as you all know, by anecdote or personally, had his ear very, very close to the ground. He was also the editor of Antiquity, which meant that he had a limitless supply of contacts and stories. And also, having spent the 50s as a television star himself, he kind of knew what worked. And so he would bring Paul. And in fact, Colin Renfrew and I made the film about the megaliths together. And it came about because Glyn rang Paul Johnson and said, I've just been up to Sheffield University with a young lecturer up there, and he's trying to redate the entire prehistory of the world, so I think perhaps we'll have a word with him. And that is precisely what we did, and a lot of programs came about that way. He was absolutely invaluable as a piece of litmus paper for what we were doing, but also somebody who introduced those of us at the coalface, as it were, to what the great minds of archaeology are.
Right. Well, one thing that Paul had an amazing quality of being able to deduce what the public would be interested in even to our sometimes horror, he'd be sent off on something thinking, well, we'll never get away with this. But in fact, he was usually right. And one particularly one was a thing called the Holy Grail book, which actually came out from a very strange discovery or non-discovery in Rain and Shadow. We never thought we'd get away with it, and it sometimes used to take us by surprise. I remember particularly myself going into Sparrow Cove in the Falkland Islands, and you'd stay there for 10 days with the prospect of making a 50-minute documentary about 2,000 tons of rotting iron. It's not going to happen. But he was right, and he did.
Well, let me ask Anna, who came into the unit as a general film director and who had not had experience of archaeology particularly, how easy were they to direct and how difficult was it to get them to be comprehensive?
Well, it was not easy. Ray had mentioned about black and white, but two of my first outings, archaeologists would come rushing over and say, we make this wonderful find, a heart, you know. And I'd go whizzing along, and there would be a slightly different shade of brown, another slightly different shade of brown. And it was quite difficult to sort of bring it to life with. But there was a kind of respect for academia that perhaps we could well remember, because we did want to serve the idea, although we say to the academics, you know, I can't do your whole book because it's taking your life, but, you know, we can perhaps condense it into a few minutes and maybe light fires that might make people go and buy your book. And we found ourselves once, I was doing a film about Phyllis Petrie in Egypt, and we were plodding through various layers of sand, and there was a spot where this great find of some pot had been made, and it was another 2 or 3 miles. And being chronicled, we plodded the 2 or 3 miles, because we felt there was a kind of authenticity about that kind of thing. You didn't make it up. So I found it both stimulating and in fact frustrating at the same time.
Yes. Since you were all involved in the early days of archaeological television, could I ask each of you your opinions on current archaeological television? Not so much time team and that, but sort of the History Channel, that sort of thing, the recreation, etc.
I think there's a dearth of ideas in all kinds of factual programming now. Just to get off the subject for a minute, the one example which hits me between the eyes every time I switch it on is Horizon. In 1970, you practically had to have a PhD in light spectrography to watch Horizon to understand it. And it had Sir Fred Boyle and the president of the Boyle Institute. Everybody who took part in Horizon was the leading expert in the world in their subject. And the audiences were fine. 4 of the directors of that series in the early 70s went on to become Hollywood film directors, so there was no shortage of talent around. But I have to say, I'm not treading on toes, but in fact, Horizon now, in terms of its intellectual rigour and its fund of ideas and stimulus, is a pale shadow of what it used to be. And I think the same might be true of an awful lot of programmes. Setting David's programmes and natural history to one side, when David started BBC Two, he started The World About Us, Horizon chronicled a programme called Life, which they all went out monthly to start with. But The World About Us, again, edited by Brian Branston, had the most amazing scope. It gave film to travellers and edited it when they brought it back, and made wonderful insights into the world. It seems to me now, unless you actually had a 6-part series in the Comedy Channel somewhere, you're not going to get a programme made about the bespectacled bear of Peru, whatever it might be. And I just think that's a pity.
Let me just add one codicil to that. It's easier to be critical of the present situation, but the present situation is different. It is fundamentally different. There is only a certain number of people who are going to watch television on any particular evening. When I started, if they wanted to watch television, they watched the programmes BBC put out. A few years after that, they had a choice. They had ITV. And a few years after that, they had a third choice, BBC Two, which is what we're talking about. So at that stage, there were just 3 choices. Now, as everybody in this hall knows, there are 50 choices. And so the struggle to attract people is far more intense than it was when, in the glory days, if that's what they were, of BBC's monopoly. And so, while I don't demur from anything that David has said, nonetheless, the problem is very, very acute as far as public television is concerned. And one is driven to think that maybe there are methods of electronic communication now which are not known to me as an aged practitioner. Young people now will use electronic communication ways which are as abstruse to me now as BBC One was 50 years ago to many people in the population. So maybe the place where you're going to find quality, intellectual quality, is not going to be on these mass public vehicles after all. If that is the case, you then are faced with another problem, which is how do you finance them adequately? Where do you get the money from to put the sort of money that we were able to put into the Silver Hill excavation or Chronicle or Buried Treasure? So it is a problem, but it is difficult now to get the audiences to justify the costs for many subjects.
I think we were very lucky, there's no doubt about that. Because we were, if you like, what David and his contemporaries were the pioneers, we came afterwards. But the opportunity to start new things and prompting Ray to talk about industrial archaeology and maritime archaeology, both of which became specialisms of his, neither of which was even known about, off television or on. A man called Professor Kenneth Hudson from Bath University wrote the book, The Thames and Hudson, called Industrial Archaeology, and that's where it went from. We were in a position, thank heavens, it made our lives wonderful, to actually pick up these ideas and run with them.
Right, David actually said it, but what actually was happening was that archaeology itself was evolving, just as we were evolving with the techniques and methods of filming and recording. It changed before our eyes, and of course before our cameras, which is very useful because it gave us something to film. And we also came up with some rather eccentric titles, one of which was Winner's Second-Hand Crane. That's exactly what any industrial archaeology society actually wanted. The second-hand crane was a really good thing to have. And the same thing with maritime archaeology. That too was, of course, a great specialism of Paul's. He was, of course, a personal authority on the subject. It was also an area where, of course, the viewers couldn't go. So it had a huge advantage. You could take them somewhere, as like David takes people into wild jungles, somewhere where the viewers themselves couldn't actually participate. So it broadened that expanse completely. But of course, what it also, as David, the other David has just said, is of course that we had the advantage of a limited number of channels. Now there is more archaeology on television than, apart from football, virtually anything else. It runs into hundreds of hours a week. And what the BBC has moved into, and this made me in some sense, is what I might call narrowcasting. The idea of a targeted audience is now rather sadly long gone. The more you put into watching on iPod, if you miss the unmissable or whatever, does this really help the cause? I personally think, as a broadcaster, as I was then, it doesn't. But the solution, I'm afraid, I don't know.
More questions? Sir? Oh, yes. Hello.
David, can I ask you something about your own roots? When I was a student of Anglo-Saxon history years ago, one of the 2 or 3 most useful books was a book by F.L. Attenborough, Frank Attenborough, who was your father. And he was one of the most influential, I hardly need to tell you, but perhaps the audience will be interested to know, was one of the most influential historians of the 20th century in Britain, because he founded the Leicester unit that brought Hoskins and Finberg and all the rest. And rumour has it that there are photographs of a tousle-haired 10-year-old in the 30s counting hedgerow species and things like that. So, although you were a biologist, can we hear a little bit about your history background?
Well, it's not. Thank you. No, you're very kind to mention my father. And my father did indeed establish a chair in local history, which I believe was the first in British University. And W.G. Hoskins, who will be known, I dare say, to some section of this audience, was the first holder of it. My father was also an extremely, as well as being an Anglo-Saxon scholar, an extremely enthusiastic cameraman, photographer. And Hoskins and he travelled around the countryside in the Midlands, taking photographs of churches and talking about building stone and counting species of plants in hedgerows and so on. And my job was my father would say, "There's a very nice shot there, my son," he'd say, "and you see, and a nice Anglo-Saxon church there, and we've got this, but you see, it's a very empty foreground, isn't it?" And I'd say, "Yes." And he'd say, "Well, now, there's a herd of cows over there, just drive them in." And being a 12-year-old, I simply did what my father told me, and I got myself into frightful trouble with farmers all over the Midlands. But anyway, thank you very much for that. Now then, how much time do we have? Oh, there are more questions there anyway. Yes, sir.
Not only seeing camel vegetable mineral, but doing so within 200 yards of where we sit in the
Okay.
Also, we've been seeing the Tolland Man special from Camel Vegetable Mineral, which I very well remember. I never was very simple question. Did you at the time realise its impact that the program like that had on the youthful mind? And I'm here today because of that program.
Well, the Tolland Man programme was another one of Paul's experimental archaeology programmes, and one with a slightly wicked turn to it, because Glyn Daniel, as I'm sure people in this room know, many do, was a bon viveur and certainly a gastronome of major proportions. And so they had got the analysis of the stomach contents of Tolland Man, who you will recall was ritually murdered in a Scandinavian bog. And he, that is Paul, had reconstructed the meal that Tolland Man had before he was literally murdered, and therefore presented it on camera to Mortimer Wheeler and Glyn Daniel for them to give a connoisseur's appreciation of what this meal was like. The universal thing was actually unprintable, but they did just say disgusting. Sir?
Can you tell us why Glyn Daniel was chosen to be a chairman of all people?
Yes, I can tell. The question is, can I explain why Glyn Daniel was chosen to be a chairman? Yes, I can, as it so happened. The first programme, in those days, it's difficult to explain to people now how alien television seemed to be in the 50s. There was this new monster among us, and people thought it was had some kind of magic, some kind of mystique, some kind of unfathomable complexity which would frighten them, and they would make them tongue-tied or behave in an extraordinary way and speak in an extraordinary way. And so people who were not fazed by the camera were quite few on the ground. And it so happened that the people who conducted quiz programs of a light entertainment nature were familiar with these things. There was also, to be fair, it wasn't just light entertainment, there were brains trusts and so on. And so you didn't think that a university academic could possibly take over and run this complex program, which was all live, as I explained. What would he do when the cameras broke down, which is what they frequently did. And so I think I'm right in saying, but I stand to correction, the first chairman on the first program of this animal vegetable mineral was a chap called Lionel Hale. Wow. And Lionel Hale was one of these strange subspecies, rare birds, who could conduct, be chairman of a quiz. And he was put in, and he wasn't in the least frightened of the cameras, but my memory was that he was actually terrified of archaeology. and so Paul, it must have been, took the decision that Lionel should say thank you very much, and there's Jenkins, and they took Glyn, who sparkled on the very first programme on the panel, and made him chairman. That's how it happened, in my memory. Yeah, madam.
Television was obviously in its very early form.
Could you have the microphone?
Television was obviously in its very early forms when these programmes were being made, and as has been mentioned, there were problems bringing the objects to life. I believe Daniel and Weaver used coloured toothpaste at one point. Can you enlighten us of the methods that you used to bring the objects to life?
Coloured toothpaste to bring the objects to life?
Never.
Wouldn't put it You're not going to spill the beans, are you? You're not going to tell them the toothpaste story, are you?
Toothpaste story.
I don't know.
Apocryphal stories, but there is one which you may be able to corroborate from me, is that one of the reasons why Simontic was so brilliant was that he employed an assistant, not necessarily the archaeologist himself, an assistant to go and see what was taken off exhibition, so he would know.
Oh.
Was that true?
No.
I don't
There's one right at the end, sir. Yes, you, sir.
I'm just waiting for the mic.
Well done.
Francis, you're the last person that needs the mic.
I've got a question for the younger, well, that's the wrong word, the grade in the middle. I beg your pardon.
You're referring to this aged gentleman here.
Many years ago, you directed me a children's series, the BBC. And you were quite firm, but I was very malleable. What I'd like to know is what was it like to direct Colin Renfrew and Sir Mortimer Weaver?
Oh boy, what a wonderful leading question. As Wheeler would say, that's a very good question. I didn't ask you to ask that. And the person that he did say that to on camera was, of course, Magnus Magnusson, who I worked with a great deal. In fact, Ray and I, the last thing I did before leaving BBC in 1980, Ray and I collaborated on a 10-part series of Magnus about Viking civilization. But he was a wonder at bringing people out. The way he brought the best out of Colin Renfrew was, first of all, to turn up late after lunch, so that Colin, who had been waiting, was by now fuming, and then, with a cheerful smile, asked Colin all the difficult questions, produced wonderful, wonderful dialogue, which you didn't have to cut at all, just put it onto the screen. So, Colin was a very, very quick learner. The other thing about, I'm in favour of television programmes which have, in the main, have some kind of interlocutor, rather than just giving yourselves, as it were, the free rein. The best example of that I can think of was Mortimer Weaver in the 60s, who made, with a very distinguished director, producer, head of BBC Three, Stephen Hurst, two programmes called The Glory That Remains and something else, in which he was given his head, the grandeur that was Rome. And because Sir Mortimer had a rather orotund sort of delivery, if there was no intermediary between him and the camera, it sometimes became very posed and almost arrogant sounding. I didn't meet him till he was 80, and worked with him on
young chap.
6. Made the best programme with him till he was older than you are now. But Magnus did a wonderful thing. What Magnus, who after all television journalist in his own right and a good writer, put himself on the back burner and really subsumed his performance entirely to Wheelers and just spent the programmes provoking Sir Mortimer into giving of his best and coming back at him and making him think on his feet. And as Colin used to have to think on his feet, suddenly asked a difficult question, which maybe Magnus and I cooked up over lunch. We'll get in this afternoon, and it just produces a sparkle, which I think prepared lines and autocue what have you done.
There's another aspect to that too that I find it particularly difficult to do, because you then, not necessarily in my case, pretend, but deliberately misunderstand what is being said to you. So at the very end, people insist on telling you this thing that they never intended to tell you at all.
Madam.
Would you suggest that in modern television there is one thing a bit better, and that it's a bit more mixed in the sexes? So
Bit more
mixed. There are more women now
Oh.
on archaeology television.
that kind of mix. Yes, I think that's true.
You know, one is struck by the fact that there was one animal, vegetable, mineral program at which they had 3 women, and that was it, wasn't it?
Well, Jaquetta Hawkes appeared fairly regularly. I could also tell you a story about Margaret Mead. Margaret Mead was agent, got in touch with the BBC, and in case there's anybody who doesn't know what Margaret Mead was anthropology written large in the United States in the 50s. She was the charismatic anthropologist in the States, and wrote lots of books about how children were brought up in Samoa and places like that. Anyway, her agent got in touch with us and said Margaret Mead was coming over and she would appear, consent to appear in our programmes on BBC. And so they said, okay, well, we invite her to appear on Animal, Vegetable, Mineral. Well, she turned up for one of these warming dinners beforehand, and again, the Beaujolais didn't do what it should have done, and they didn't get on with her very well. Do you remember this particular one? You
didn't see this story.
She got very, I have to say, she got very grumpy. And when we got into the taxi to go to the Nine Go studio, she was really quite fed up. When we got in, the Glyn said, now we will have the first object, and she gave it to Professor Margaret Mead. And Margaret Mead said, I think this is a stupid program. I have no idea what this object is, and it's quite absurd to suppose that anybody would, and that kind of sort of just silly bits of unconnected information isn't something that I'm least interested in. And so there was a hiatus. But what she didn't know was that we always gave one object to the program before the program started transmission, in order that people should actually get into the mood of things, and that her statement that had not been seen by anybody at all. She was sitting on the end of the bench and it was like this, looking away from, and we simply pushed the cameras in, and although she was introduced, she never said anything, and her image was never seen, and she went back to America. And once more, nobody actually noticed. But women in television, that is another bag of tricks or something. My own feeling is that actually it's not as bad as it was. Jaquetta Hawkes, as I say, did appear regularly and was brilliant and beautiful and perceptive.
And Kathleen Kenyon did also did.
Kathleen Kenyon too.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's one of the first.
So, I mean, I would have thought the proportion of archaeologists who appeared, feminine archaeologists who appeared, was pretty, on television, was not dissimilar from the number in the actual academic profession, I hope.
May I add something? It's a common misconception that women in the BBC are rather new phenomenon. In fact, in your day when you joined and when I joined, it was run by some extremely fierce ladies, including Mary Adam and
every
Spicer and others.
Every boss I had in the BBC was a woman.
I think one of the reasons that women find making documentaries more accessible and more of them are joining in with television now, which is an excellent thing, is because the cameras are so portable now and so relatively simple to use. I remember David and David and I made a program in Nigeria which required someone to go with the camera into the women's quarters of the Oba of Benin's palace. And that was Anna, and we gave her a 3-day course on using a small camera. We're talking about the mid-70s. Now, Anna was a fine director, but by and large was not a cinematographer. She is a cinematographer now, as indeed nearly every young woman or young man going into television these days have to do. How often do you see on the credits, written, directed and produced by Jennifer so-and-so or Arnold somebody else? And something that, shame to say, I would have to retrain entirely if I were able to do anything like that. I couldn't. We used to go on vacation with a superb cameraman, a wonderful sound recordist, an assistant, and a PA if you're lucky. That doesn't happen anymore.
Anna, do you want to say something into the microphone?
I did go to film schools. I barely knew how to load in a Claire magazine if I had 10 hours. But technology has made it possible now for many of us to make films actually all by ourselves. And it's terrific, except that it suggests that there's no craft involved. Just because you can press the buttons, there's actually no skill. And cameramen who learn about lighting, editors who learn about pace and rhythm, sound recordists who learn about sound, it's not a skill that you just pick up because you can press the buttons. And I think there's a danger now that we're all so techie mad and we can all do it, but it actually doesn't look terrific half the time because it's not really backed up with proper craft. And I'm sort of a bit like David. I think that the future probably does lie in different forms of transmission apart from television. But I do think we've got to learn and remind ourselves about storytelling techniques. It's not enough just to stick music all over everything or flash frames. You have to work out what it is you want to say, whether it's today or yesterday. You have to really work. It's the medium, it's not the message.
As I will tell you, it was just largely single-handedly made. The British Museum's film on Moctezuma and now Tell said, but it's just available now. And she did most of the stuff because she's a highly accomplished film editor, which is a craft in itself. And so she's fortunate in being able to have all these disciplines at her fingertips. But for someone like me, for instance, I need somebody to tell me that the train is coming behind you while you've got your eye through the camera, because that's what a director essentially can do. It's not, in my view, possible to divide your attention 3 ways: to shoot it, to listen to it, and then to direct it at the same time. One or other will take precedence. So it's a new business, but it has its benefits.
I think we're all in a bit too much of a hurry, really. I mean, the great thing that we were privileged to have was teams. We got to know one another. We got to understand one another. We got to learn about the subject. Now people have to rush off and in half a moment supposed to get a few things off Google and then rush out and make a film. And there is a danger that it's all becoming very slight and surface, and there's no real depth to much. And there's certainly not much enjoyment a lot of the time, which we all are fortunate to have had.
Well, I don't know how long we've allowed for this to go on, but I suspect we've probably come to the penultimate question, who is standing over there.
Does David think that a program like animal, mineral, vegetables would be what it is today?
Oddly enough, in a way which is really quite mysterious, it's very difficult to understand. The word zeitgeist comes to mind. I'm not sure what it means, but the zeitgeist that was around that liked this discursive animal, vegetable, mineral is not today's zeitgeist. In fact, there was an attempt to make a revival of animal, vegetable about a decade ago, I think. And
it was actually it was as early as the 1970s. David.
Was it?
It was a great.
But it didn't work.
Yeah.
It didn't work, and it's quite hard to identify why it didn't work. You can.
I know why. I know why it didn't work, and I take some small responsibility for it, about that much responsibility for it, because I wasn't involved in the making of the program. It was made by a couple of friends of mine in the department, and they said, well, you know archaeology, you know the people involved, and I said I thought you might try putting on the panel, if you were going to do a program with items from a museum which is related, say the Wessex Museum in Devizes, then why not have 3 panellists who each in their own ways are experts on the Wessex culture. And of course the beauty of the original ABM was that half the people on the panel hadn't a clue what anything was, and that was getting its entertainment value. So they made a very worthy series of 10 ABMs in 1978 or something. But it didn't work, partly because they took that little bit of advice from me. It was a mistake.
I think there was something more profound than that, in that the nature of archaeology by that stage had changed immensely. That the kind of all-purpose universal knowledge which the original contestants had was able to be got away with, if you like, whereas now it's begun with so many subdivisions. It's hard to find anybody who even wish to pretend to have that universality. And that, I think, was the difficulty. The largest of the Wheeler's population was such that it was irreplaceable. And I think that was the problem.
Right, well now, one last question. 7 hands gone up. Who's got a microphone? Anyone near? You have, sir. Okay, you're yes, wherever it was.
We've heard some great stories today about these colourful characters of the craft of archaeology. I'd like to ask a question about Richard Atkinson and the relationship between the production team and the directorial team of the Silver Hill excavations. Thinking about time team, the way that the 3-day format informs the way that the production team to film the programme, I guess to a certain degree that the actual excavation is also informed by the way that it is filmed. Is that the same for the Silver Hill excavation? The relationship between Benson and artists?
I think Sir David touched on this earlier on when he said that the undertaking was that the television would follow the rhythm, if that's the right word, of the excavation. I'm sorry, I can't really quite see what you're getting at. You're talking about whether
Was the excavation itself informed by the difficulties of actually trying to film it?
Yes and no. What we did was, the way we worked it was that the programmes were live. When that screen goes blank, you're on the air, which was extremely terrifying, as you might imagine. I mean, when I first started in television, outside broadcast, most of the outside broadcast directors had flown Spitfires and Hurricanes during the Battle of Britain. You had to have that, not in my case. And there's no doubt at all that by going live, we gave the programme an edge each time we went on the air, which was about 4 or 5 times in the space of 2 years. But then, as David said, we had cameras there all the time, but they were news cameras or film cameras, and we were filming events as they went along, as they occurred, be at the end of the telephone, drive up the A4 from Line Road, And we'd take the material back to the cutting room, edit it, put it onto telecine, and run it in from London according to the script that we'd made up for that particular item. You couldn't push Richard Attenborough, Richard Atkinson to go any faster than he was going, or to find anything that he didn't want to find. And I think what is quite impressive is that the overall findings at Silbury in 1968-69 are, to all intents and purposes, the findings that English Heritage made 2 years ago with their great rescue dig, the most valuable operation that used the opportunity to do more archaeology. They went to the centre of the hill. And I think, given the circumstances, Atkinson found everything that there was to be found in the time and money available.
It's irresistible to ask one last question about that. Can I just chip in?
Yeah.
You obviously saw the more recent Lion TV film on Silbury Hill. You actually produced a brilliant series 30, 40 years earlier, on the set. What went wrong between those two films in terms of the way they appeared on TV?
If I give an honest response, then it might offend somebody, and it's difficult in this sea of faces.
Please offend a few people, but it's important to know.
I come back to what I was saying to Anna and Ray just now about the importance of having the right intermediary, and I think that programme had two intermediaries who were absolutely wrong in both cases. Both the Scotsman who stood at the top of his flowing locks and the girl who looked like a goth and rushed around expatiating about the hill. Neither of them knew the first thing about the hill, neither of them had done their homework, and I thought it was an indifferent account, I have to say. Sorry about that.
Well, I think could we end on a higher note? Yeah. All right, there's one over there, the lady there, and this really must be the last.
Archaeology has always been extremely controversial, and I wonder if the Maple programs ever came up against any protests, problems, religious, political barriers.
I didn't hear that. Could you?
If you or we ever came across any religious prejudice or true upsets, I can name one.
Go ahead.
Central Hall, Westminster, with Magnus after we made a programme called The Archaeology of the Bible Lands, which set out with Professor James Pritchard from Pennsylvania to see whether archaeology would make the Old Testament stand up. And frankly, in many cases it didn't. And when we actually proposed that maybe King Solomon didn't exist, the Christadelphians called a mass meeting of about this many people in Westminster Hall, and we sat at the back and were publicly called the Antichrists.
Well, there we are.
Thank with the greatest warmth
not only the three participants whom Sir David summoned to the platform, who've spoken so effectively and in some cases so candidly about their experiences, but above all, Sir David himself, the great inspiration of early television and archaeology, and more recently, the great inspiration of this occasion. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much.